It's time for another festival edition video as our next biblical festival is upon us yet again. It's the festival of Shavuot that happens very soon as I record this video. And I always like to do a reflection for this playlist that we have on YouTube. I've been actually wanting Shavuot to come back around because it was a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Rabbi Fohrman did one of my favorite teaching series on the festival of Shavuot. Has about 6 videos in the series, and I'm just going to give a cursory flyby of some of the themes there, so all credit goes to him on this content, and really want to encourage you to check it out. I do believe you'll have to have a membership to view that video series in full, but if it's my way, I can help promote that work, and I know a lot of you that follow my stuff have a membership to Aleph Beta already, so you'll be able to see that. But Fohrman starts this teaching in this series with a question that was a big part. It was a question I asked a lot as well when I thought about Shavuot. When you read, Shavuot would be what we also call Pentecost in the Christian world, or the Festival of Weeks, sometimes it's called. The Hebrew word is Shavuot, which refers to those weeks. It's the Festival of Weeks, Shavuot. And he asked this question because when you read about Shavuot in the biblical text in Torah, it talks about harvest. It's a festival that's connected to the harvest. It talks about when you harvest the land and you bring in the sheaves in the harvest, and to make sure that you give these offerings. It's a festival of thanksgiving and gratitude and praise to God. It makes a point of talking about how you're to share that with everyone. It's not just for the farmers and the landowners, but it's for everybody, your sons and your daughters and your manservants and your maidservants, and make sure the foreigners, like everybody is included. And I hear echoes of that. Every year we read the book of Ruth for Shavuot. And obviously Ruth is a story about this very festival. It's a story about this very time of year, this very harvest. And obviously she's an outsider. She's an alien, an orphan, a widow. She's a foreigner. And so you have this story that's very fitting for the theme of, but the point being this: when you read about Shavuot in Torah, it's completely about the harvest. When you read about Shavuot with the rabbis, or with any kind of modern Judaism, Shavuot is all about Sinai and the giving of the law. And both are beautiful celebrations, but it feels like the rabbis have not rooted their observance in the Torah. The Torah talks about harvest and land and says nothing about Mount Sinai or the giving of the law. And the rabbis don't talk about the harvest and the land hardly at all. They only talk about Sinai and the giving of the law. So what gives? Usually the rabbis are right on top of it, so there might be more of a connection than we think. And Rabbi Fohrman, in typical Rabbi Fohrman style, says, indeed, the rabbis are in fact onto something. And so Fohrman goes and he says, I feel like when I'm reading about Shavuot, and it's talking about the harvest, and it starts talking about Passover, and you count 7 days for Passover, and after Passover, then there are 7 weeks that follow. There are 7 sevens that follow, and that's the time of harvest. And at the end of harvest, at the end of the 7 sevens, you're supposed to celebrate Shavuot. And Fohrman says, well, golly, when I hear 7 sevens, I think about something. I think about Yovel, is what you say in the Hebrew, but the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee also happens after 7 sevens. And so Fohrman shows how many parallels there are between the celebration of Shavuot and the celebration of the year of Jubilee, which are obviously both in Torah, but they're pretty disconnected. These are not two festivals or calendar times that are directly tied together, and yet there's all kinds of literary ties. There's the 7 sevens plus 1, so there's 7 sevens, and then the next is the celebration. So Shavuot happens on the 50th day, Jubilee happens on the 50th year, right? There's all these linguistic ties. If you want to see how many Hebrew parallelisms there are in the text between the same 3 Hebrew words being used in the same order and the 2 stories in the same place, you'll have to watch Fohrman's series to show how he does that. He also talks about the parallel of the shofar. Obviously, Yovel is marked by the blowing of the shofar. That's how the year of Jubilee begins. The year of Jubilee begins by blowing a shofar. Sometimes a shofar is called a Yovel. In the year of Jubilee, it just talks about the blowing of a shofar. What's interesting is that the very word for that shofar is also the word Yovel for Jubilee. But there's also at Mount Sinai, what are we told? The blowing sound of a shofar that gets louder and louder. And so you have shofars, and you have 7 times 7 plus 1, and you have these linguistic ties. You have the same themes of land and harvest and ownership seem to show up in both of these stories. And so Fohrman spends a good 2 videos in these 6 videos, in this 6-video series, showing the connection, undeniable connection between Shavuot and Yovel. And in typical Fohrman fashion, will just blow your mind. And then Fohrman says, well, golly, when I think about Yovel, you know what I actually also think about is when I think about these same connections in 7 sevens, I think about the story of Jericho. And then Fohrman goes on to show how many connections are happening in Jericho. They walk around the city 7 times for 7 days. There are 7 priests. There's 7 circuits. There's 7 shofars. Oh, wait, there's another parallel. There's the blowing of shofars. It's like all of the same elements that are in Yovel are also present in Jericho. And so many of these same elements are what connect it to Shavuot. In fact, the exact same phrase that's used in Yovel is the phrase in the Hebrew, I have it written in my notes, to cause to pass a shofar blast. So God says, I want you to cause to pass a shofar blast. That's what happens in Yovel. It's the same exact phrase that God tells the people in the Jericho story. I want you to cause to pass a shofar blast. Not only this, but there's also what the shofars are called. In the story of Jericho, the shofars are called Shofrot Yovelim. Shofrot Yovelim. Right? The shofars, the Yovel shofars. Well, that's exactly the same phrase of what the shofars are called at Sinai. Sinai is the only place where the same story, with all of these parallels, also calls Shofrot Yovelim. Maybe the rabbis are onto something when they connect Sinai to the harvest. They connect Shavuot and Yovel and Jericho all together. There's also the connection between Sinai and Jericho of, remember, if you touch the mountain at the story of Sinai, you will die. We're told in Jericho that if anybody rebuilds Jericho, they will certainly die. There's also the same kind of Hebraic linguistic connections that Fohrman will show beyond a reasonable doubt that these stories are supposed to be connected. So there's this triangle of connections between Sinai and Jubilee, between Jubilee and Jericho, and between Jericho and Sinai. So these stories are all sorts of connected. We're about halfway through the video series when Fohrman says, so why are all these stories connected? What are the themes that we can start to pull away? And Fohrman says, well, at the end of the story of Jericho, what do you have? You have walls falling down, and you have a lot of talk from God about freedom and ownership. Freedom and ownership. When you had Sinai, what did you have? You had a lot of conversation about freedom and maybe a divine ownership, but we'll come back to that in a moment. When you talk about Yovel, what are you really talking about when you talk about the year of Jubilee? Well, you talk about the freeing of slaves and giving the land back to its original owner. These are the driving themes of the year of Jubilee. The driving themes of the year of Jubilee, which are reinforced in the story of Jericho. And Fohrman starts to say, I wonder if there's anything here to learn about Shavuot, is this idea of freeing slaves and ancestral land. Fohrman will actually go back to Genesis 15 And he'll say this is actually the exact same connection that God makes when he's telling Abraham about what's going to happen to his ancestors when they go down to Egypt. God will tell Abraham in Genesis 15, he'll say, your ancestors are going to end up in Egypt where they are going to be strangers. And because they're strangers, they're going to be enslaved by the Egyptians. And because they're slaves, they're going to be abused. And Fohrman uses the same formula to show why this is at the heart of the Jubilee year. Reversing this, making sure that this same abuse, this same slavery never happens in God's new economy, God's Sinai world that he's building when he rescues his people out of Egypt. God's wanting to make sure that this kind of slavery and this kind of oppression never happens. And God knows that there's an intimate connection between this slavery and this abuse and land ownership. In a literal sense, in a material sense, and in an even bigger metaphorical sense as well. Like, what is it that God told Abraham? Your ancestors will be strangers, and that's why they're going to be enslaved. When you don't own land and you are foreigners in a foreign land, that's when you end up in these relationships of enslavement. And it's these relationships of enslavement that lead to abuse. Actually, in one of the videos, Fohrman will talk about a personal example of a woman that he knows and that he met, and she was an immigrant from Honduras that was running for her life. And she didn't know how to work the legal systems of asylum, and she ends up in this illegal immigrant status in the States, and she ends up working in a job, in a relationship with this group of people because she's an illegal immigrant, and because of her illegal immigrant status, it's what enables these other groups of people to abuse her, not just in overworking, but to physically abuse her because she's stuck. She's a foreigner. She has no land, and this is why she ends up in relationships that can abuse her, and she can't get out of it, because if she were to call the police or the authorities, they would simply deport her for being here illegally. There is a connection to land and enslavement and abuse, and God knows this. And so at the heart of the year of Jubilee is God connecting people back to their ancestral homeland. That's how freedom is maintained. Over the course of this 50 years, you have these Sabbath years, these Shemitas, all these rhythms and systems that are meant to kind of hold off this spin out, this devolvement where people get separated from land and put in oppressive relationships because of this separation. And every 50 years, God rewinds the tapes, puts everything back so that freedom and autonomy can thrive. And that reality is going to be held in place because of land ownership. What does any of this have to do with Shavuot? Fohrman says that's the great conclusion that we're supposed to realize. This is what the rabbis may even be getting at, is one of the phrases that you hear God say in the Jericho story. One of the phrases that you hear God say in Jubilee year, one of the things that God keeps trying to insinuate at Sinai, these three stories are kind of held together by one undercurrent, and it's this: it was always God's land to begin with. You see, the giving of the law, the giving of Torah, what the rabbis are asking us to celebrate, is somehow connected to the very land and the harvest that the Bible tells God's people to celebrate. And there's a reminder, the rabbis say, in the text itself, to remember as you harvest this land, to remember as you reap the sheaves and you celebrate the festival and you bring them into the temple. There's a reminder it was never your land to begin with. You don't really own it. What did Jubilee talk about? Returning things to its ancestral land. What does it teach us about the Festival of Weeks? It was always God's land. And so what does Shavuot remind us as we gather our harvest and we bring the sheaves and we throw the party? What does Shavuot say in the biblical text? Not the rabbis, but what does the biblical text tell us? Make sure that you have all the outsiders. Make sure you do this with your sons and your daughters and your manservants and your maidservants and all of your migrant workers, and bring everybody in to celebrate this festival, because in doing that, it will remind you that it was never your land to begin with. And this thing that God was building, was always about the freedom and ancestral place that everybody has at the table. I wrote down a couple quotes here to close. Fohrman said this: Sinai is where we came to have our Father, to know our Father. Sinai is where we entered God's family in the biblical story. He rescues us out of Egypt. He brings us as the story of Passover, and then 7 weeks later, the people of God stand at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and they are reminded that they have a new family now. And it's this dad that provides in our harvest. It's this dad that takes care of his kids, but they're his kids, and it's his family, and he cares about all of them, not just me. Let's see, do I have one more note here? Yes, just that last note. Torah reminds us to remember whose true ownership it is, and that it was never my family, it's not my land, but I belong in this greater story with all these relationships that I'm called to steward and to protect their freedom and their place. And it's a very material story. It's part of the things that I love about thinking about Shavuot in this way, is it's not just abstract, it's not just, oh, everybody, God wants us to love everyone, theology talk. It's rooted in material realities of land ownership and oppressive relationships and monetary realities. So at any rate, listen, the series is amazing. He goes into so much more depth. It'd be 6-7 times longer than what I just did in this one video alone. And he'll draw on some beautiful points, and he'll articulate it in such better ways than I did here. But if that's a helpful reflection to kind of summarize that series and that teaching, which I probably didn't even do well. If he were to watch this, he'd probably be like, that's not even the point I was trying to make. That's some of the notes that I took away and some of the things that I appreciated. But you should watch it. You should see what kind of things you take away. I'll put the link in the description of the video. And may you have a good Shavuot. May you have a good weekend. And may all of us, Jew or Gentile, remember we're all a part of God's family, but it's his family. We're all a part of God's family, and they're all his kids, and he cares about all of them, all of his kids. And may that guide our way as we figure out what it means to be human in God's good world. All right? Those are my thoughts for Shavuot. We'll see you when the fall festivals roll around on the other side of my sabbatical. We'll talk to you then. Thanks, everybody.